Hello, I'm Saremy with So, and I've been doing a lot of seam finishes lately, and I wanted to share the Hong Kong finish with you. I'm going to be showing you how to do the Hong Kong finish on a facing because it has both interior and exterior curves, and it's one of my favorite places to use the Hong Kong finish, especially if you don't have a serger and you don't want to overlock that edge or hem it. The Hong Kong finish is a really great solution for that. It's also going to be less bulky than binding because we're only going to be folding it one time rather than twice. The binding that I'm using today is a little wider than what I need for this width finish. I'm going to be using 1 3/8 inch wide binding. It's about 35 millimeters. Technically, you need 3 times the finished width of your desired Hong Kong finish, plus a little bit extra to hang past the stitching right here. So you want to make sure you give yourself enough to catch it. If you're new to sewing Hong Kong finish and you plan on doing this with something with curves, I recommend going a little wider than what you need because it sometimes is hard to catch it on some of these curves. So you want to give yourself some wiggle room. You can always trim it down. That's what I did here afterward, and it's fine because binding does not ravel, but since it's cut on the bias, you're not ever going to see threads coming from this raw edge here. And no one's going to see this raw edge. You're going to, if they ever see your facing, right? So I really love using this on interior seams, especially if someone's going to see, a flash of the inside of your jacket, or it's going to be hanging on a hanger and you want it to look nice for a presentation. Maybe you want a pretty Instagram photo. It's just a really elegant way to finish the insides of your garment without lining it. Or maybe the fabric is a little scratchy and you want to make it softer against your skin. This is a really great solution for that as well. It's less bulky than binding since you're only folding it once. For this project, I used a contrast binding to the facing fabric, which, I've done this before, but I also used a thread color that doesn't match. So yours is guaranteed to look nicer if you use a matching thread color that either matches your binding or whatever you're sewing the binding to. All right, are you ready to get to it? Let's do it. All right, the first one we're going to do today is the Hong Kong finish, and I chose a facing since it has some curves. Most Hong Kong finishes are on straighter seams, so I thought I'd do this so we can have a little some tips along the way for doing curves. I'm using a bias binding that is 1 3/8 inch wide, or 35 millimeters. So I say pick something that's going to be roughly like 4 times the width of your finished seam. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam on my Hong Kong finish, and that'll give us enough to sew our seam, turn it, wrap it, pass by again, and we'll have a little bit extra there, and that's a little wider than I plan on sewing it. So I would go a little wider because especially if you're doing curves, because it'll give you a little bit more leeway. All right, so I'm going to go all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam, right sides together because we're going to see this on the right side of the facing. Now when I get to these interior curves like this, I'm going to just tug a tiny bit so that it's not too long when it gets on the other side. When I get to these exterior curves, I'm going to relax my hold on the binding and let it just sit 1-to-1 ratio. And even if I can kind of let it relax a lot, that'll help when we turn it around that outer curve. And I've just sewn my facing together, but I didn't finish my seams. You don't really need to on a facing. You can notice I don't use pins because I find it a little easier to hold the binding and just sort of position it, and both these hands are moving together. You can pin this or clip it, whatever works for you. All right, so we're at that interior curve again, so I just barely pull it, just a tiny, tiny bit. Just more that I'm holding it taut. All right, now we're going to take this to the iron and we're going to press it. All right, so the first thing I do is press with it right side up, and I'm just going to press the bias toward the edge. And I can see right here I have a little bit of unevenness. We really want a nice even seam, so let's just trim this down. All right, now we're going to put it wrong side up. These facings are kind of wily, aren't they? All right, and we're not bending this seam allowance. We're going to bend the binding to go around it. So we want that seam allowance to stay nice and flat. Try not to get any folds in it. Sometimes it wants to do that. So we don't really want this binding right here to stretch too much. Going on this interior curve, you see how it's pulling this up. I can kind of shape it with the iron. And another thing we're looking for right now is we're making sure that this raw edge is going well past our original seam allowance, because now we're going to stitch in the ditch and we want to be able to catch this little edge. So let's just take a look from this side and make sure we like everything. And I'm going to give it one more press. And you can see this is why you want a little bit of a wider piece than maybe you need of binding, because right here you can see it's having trouble reaching because of that interior curve. Bias is stretchy, but there's only so much that you can ask it to do. All right, that's looking really nice. Let's just give it a once over here. And now we're going to stitch in the ditch. So we want to try and sink our needle in this seam right here between the binding and the facing. And you made sure that your raw edge is going to cover the seam all along that edge. And if you use a thread that matches, it'll look a lot better. I have a pretty big needle in right now too. It's about size 16 since I was just sewing a tool case. And it's working okay. If my thread matched, I think I'd like it a little better. All right, there we go. Looks like I fell onto the binding right here, this little section here. You can see my white thread. Usually when you stitch in the ditch, you're pulling the seam apart and sinking that needle in there, and that's pretty hard to do when you're doing the Hong Kong finish, but when your thread matches, you're using the correct needle size, it's going to disappear in there. It's going to look really nice. Now, if you wanted to trim away this excess, you can. Bias binding doesn't unravel or fray. That's one of the great things about it. So you can just trim it really close, and it'll be just fine. I would recommend trimming it just so you don't have to iron this, because you don't really want to create more work for yourself when you're wearing whatever you've made. I would trim it down. And you're going to kind of feel like, oh, maybe I didn't really need such a wide binding piece. But then you'll get to some sections of a curve and you'll realize, oh, I would have probably not been able to sew that if I didn't have that width. So once you've done a few Hong Kong finishes, you'll figure out exactly what size binding you like with the seam width that you like to use, and probably different widths for different applications. Just remember to always pre-wash your binding, especially if you've bought it from somewhere else. Pre-wash it, because if you sew it on to fabric that's already been washed, you'll probably get a disappointment when you get it out of the washing machine the first time after finishing your project. All right, there we go. I could probably trim that a lot nicer. And there we go. We have a Hong Kong finish on facing.